Welcome back. This is the Part-Time Economist. Today we're talking about something a little bit different. We're not talking about economics or managing your money. Today we're talking about morals and ethics. And this is a book by Stefan Molyneux called Universally Preferable Behaviour, subtitled A Rational Proof of Secular Ethics. So why would we need this kind of a book? Why would we need to prove that ethical codes exist from a secular standpoint? As we move into a more and more multicultural, diverse society, we're starting to find that different cultures have different ideas of what's acceptable, especially with regards to religion and things like that. So the question arises, if you can't prove that a certain religion is true, but you still want to live peacefully together in a society, how do you find an objective standard of conduct? How do you find universally preferable behavior? That's the question that this book attempts to answer. So let's jump right in. First off, why does Stefan call this universally preferable behavior instead of simply ethics or morals? The reason behind this is that yes, Stefan believes that ethics and morals are indeed objective, universal, but that they're not mandatory. For example, we know that there's the law of gravity, and without exception, any two objects in the universe are attracted to each other through gravity. You can be the worst human being, the most immoral person, but you're still going to be subject to the laws of gravity. The same can't be said of morals and ethics, right? I can break the law, I can steal, I can pillage, I can plunder, I can do all of these things. It doesn't make it right, so I'm violating an objective framework, but I'm still able to do it. I have that capacity. So what Stefan is saying is that there are these ethics and morals, and they're absolute. They're non-bending, but you can break them. And for people that say, oh, well, that's a bunch of hogwash, you have to remember that the scientific method is the basis upon which we do all of our analysis, right? Every advance in science has come from the scientific method, more or less. And the scientific method itself is optional, right? So if you're trying to invent a new drug or find a way to fight some disease, or even build a new product, you don't have to use the scientific method. You could just haphazardly try things and hope you get it right. So the scientific method is optional, but it's also universally preferred as the method to achieve the valid results. So hopefully that explains why Stefan calls it preferable behavior instead of mandatory or something similar. So the first question, before we even try to validate his theory, is, does some kind of universally preferable behavior exist? And Stefan gives a number of proofs and arguments for this in his book, but personally two of these stood out the most for me. The first is the axiomatic proof. So if one person puts forward the argument that there's such a thing as universally preferable behavior, you have two choices. You can accept the argument and say, okay, yeah, some behaviors are indeed universally preferable. But if you say, no, universally preferable behavior does not exist, then what are you doing? Because you're contradicting someone on what you believe is an erroneous statement, you are therefore expressing that truth is universally preferable to lying, right? So any contradiction by saying that universally preferable behavior does not exist inherently contradicts itself. So you can't argue against universally preferable behavior in the sense that it exists at least in some form, right? We've not nailed down all the details of what it constitutes and how it's applied, but at least in some sense UPB does exist. If that argument didn't convince you, another one that he makes is the argument from existence, right? So there's billions and trillions of life forms, humans, bacteria, animals, plants, all of this, right? And they all have to do something to live, right? So humans, if we drink a glass full of poison, we will die, right? That's not negotiable. So, if humans want to live, it is universally preferable that they not drink glasses of poison, right? We can't keep them from drinking it, but at the same time, it's preferable if they want to continue living. So hopefully this explains both the foundation and the validation of UPB existing, but also again reiterates the point of why it's called preferable behavior. So now that Stefan establishes a baseline and that UPB does exist, we try to think, what is UPB, right? And how can we develop a moral theory that falls under universally preferable behavior? And Stefan says on page 28 that the methodology for judging and proving a moral theory is exactly the same as the methodology for judging and proving any other theory, right? So if I'm trying to prove that gravity exists, I'm going to do experiments, I'm going to do things like this, but more importantly, my valid scientific theory has to meet several criteria. It has to be universal, right? So I can't say that gravity exists on the Earth but not on the moon. We know that we weigh less on the moon, but that further just proves gravity because the moon has less mass, and therefore, according to the theory, we would expect the gravity to be less. A scientific theory has to be logical, right? It can't contradict itself. It has to be empirically verifiable, right? We can go out, we can see this, we can do experiments. It has to be reproducible. So this means that I can't just get one result one time, right? If I let go of a pen, it's going to hit the floor every single time under the same conditions. And it has to be as simple as possible, right? So again, let's stick with the gravity example. When I drop my pen to the floor, right, we can say that there's a universal attraction between all items that have mass in the universe, and this draws the pen towards the Earth. That's the simple explanation. I could also say that I have magical powers and that I am forcing the pen down to the ground through some sort of supernatural power or something like this, right? That's a much more complex theory, and it's best to use the simplest explanation where possible. Stefan also lists what the requirements for virtue are, right? So, in order to have virtue, you must have a choice in the matter. Consider a rock, and it falls down a hill because the wind blew it, and it lands on this guy's car and it makes him wreck. No one's going to blame the rock for doing this because it has no moral agency, it doesn't have a choice in the matter. Now, let's say that instead a criminal gets up there and he's throwing this rock, he's pushing it towards the car that's coming down the road. Of course, we would blame the man and not the rock. Why? Because the rock, one, doesn't have a choice in the matter, but two, the man is taking an active approach by pushing this rock down the hill. Now, it gets even more complicated because we now have two men. One man pushes the rock, but he's only doing it because the other man has a gun to his head and tells him that if he doesn't push the rock down the hill, he's going to shoot him. Of course, we hold the man with the gun more responsible because he has the most choice in the matter. The guy that's pushing the rock, yes, he does have a choice. He could say, you know what, I'm not pushing this rock, I'm going to get shot. But we still view him as having much, much less choice than the man who's holding the gun, thus making the man with the gun significantly more responsible for that action. Another requirement for virtue or a breach of morals is the avoidance, right? So let's say that I'm a mob boss, right? And I have my turf, I have my area of the street, and it's what I own, right? And let's say that this is in New York, and I write a letter to someone in California, and I tell them, if you ever come to my street, I'm going to do some kind of grave harm to you and your family, right? That's bad, of course, and it is indeed threatening him, but it's very easy for that man in California to avoid this because he would have to travel halfway across the country. So we don't view that as being as bad as if, let's say I tell a guy that lives one neighborhood over, if you ever come to my street, I'm going to do serious harm to you and your family. The reason we consider this more evil, more wicked, more immoral is because this man has less capacity to avoid it. And then the last requirement for virtue, Stefan says that we can't say that a man that's in a coma, right, it's impossible for him to do anything immoral. So if we say not giving to charity is immoral, right, obviously the man in the coma can't give to charity, and he has no control over his actions, so we would say that he's immoral. But according to Stefan's theory, it's ridiculous, it's ludicrous to say that a man in a coma is immoral. So instead of saying that it's immoral not to give to charity, let's say something like it is immoral to rape, it is immoral to kill. Because in this, the man who's in the coma is still capable of being virtuous, is not going to be immoral by refraining from doing an action. Honestly, this was a very hard book for me, and I had to read it 2 or 3 times because it's a very tricky subject, right? Because the majority of morals and ethics, we're told that they come from governments, or they come from religious leaders or doctrines, things like this. But the idea that you can secularly prove a rational set of objective ethics definitely took me a while to wrap my head around, and like I said, I had to read it several times. If you're interested in the book, it will take you a couple reads to understand it. And Stefan gives the overarching theory, the framework as I discussed, but then he goes into specific applications. So he uses UPB and the framework to discuss issues such as rape, theft, lying, fraud, murder, why these things are immoral. That's all I have for this one. I will see you next time.